I've spent my whole professional life working in the field of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological. And the EMP threat, the electromagnetic pulse threat, is the one that concerns me most and concerns my colleagues on the Congressional EMP Commission the most, because it constitutes the greatest threat to our civilization. And yet, even after many years of trying to educate the public and the Congress about this, it is still not a well understood threat, and many people even have difficulty pronouncing electromagnetic pulse. And I don't blame them. It sounds like it's going to be really boring and make your eyes glaze over. Well, I'll try not to do that. But it is crucially important for you to understand this threat, because the survival of our civilization is literally at stake. And to try to put this threat into context, I want to talk to you a little bit about history. We've talked before in the earlier panel about the importance of history, and it's important in national security as well. In fact, history is one of the most important things. I was originally trained as a historian and an archaeologist, and by peculiar dint of fate and my own personal history, I ended up becoming a specialist in nuclear weapons and electromagnetic pulse and working at the CIA and all the rest. On understanding history, Cicero said that the man who does not understand what happened before he was born is forever a child. So let's not be a child, at least about EMP, and put it in historical context. I want to go back. Here's a book that I picked up because on occasion I like to try to escape EMP, and it's called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. It's by another archaeologist and historian named Eric H. Klein. And he's talking about a great dark ages that happened 12 centuries before Christ. Those of you familiar with the Old Testament may have heard of the ancient civilizations like Babylon and the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks. And perhaps you may have wondered, well, what happened to them, right? Well, it happened that there was a thing called, about 12 centuries before Christ, a group called the Sea People invaded. We don't know who they were, where they came from, but they invaded the Mediterranean region, and they were hunter-gatherers at a much lower level of technology than the advanced civilizations of the time, and they were advanced civilizations 12 centuries before Christ. They had beautiful art, they had systems of mathematics, all of them had writings, they had kept histories. We've been able to translate a lot of those languages, and we now know, what was going on among the kings of the Hittites and among the Babylonians, because we've been able to translate their literature. But these higher tech civilizations that were agricultural, the great agricultural empires, were attacked by these barbarians who were at a much lower level of technology. And the barbarians figured out that if they could attack the critical infrastructures of the time, burn down the vineyards, destroy the crops, kill the cattle in the field, make the roads unsafe so that you can't travel anymore, make the sea lanes unsafe, they basically knocked the technological props out from those civilizations, from those early civilizations, and they ceased to exist. They ceased to exist. Their cities disappeared, their art disappeared, their languages became dead languages. Basically, only the ancient Egyptians came through that first dark ages that Western civilization experienced 12 centuries ago. And I had gotten this book actually as a Christmas present from somebody. And as I said, I would like to go back to my original reading of history, to sort of escape the gloomy prospects that hang over us now from EMP. But imagine my surprise when in the back of the book, the gentleman basically alludes to the EMP phenomena. In a paragraph toward the end, he talks about, we might picture a modern power grid that has been disrupted, perhaps by a storm or an earthquake, wherein the electric company can still produce power, but cannot get it out to the individual consumers. We see such events on an annual basis in the United States, caused by anything and everything, from tornadoes in Oklahoma to snowstorms in Massachusetts. If the disruption is permanent, as might be the case in a major catastrophe, such as a nuclear explosion today, eventually even the production of the electricity will halt. The analogy may hold for the late Bronze Age, albeit at a lower technological level. So even Eric Klein understands the civilization-ending consequences of an EMP. that caused the first dark ages that affected Western civilization 12 centuries before Christ. Now, Klein Point observes that it took about 5 to 7 centuries for Western civilization to come back from that first dark ages. And it began with the Greek civilization. We started to crawl back up from that first dark ages. And eventually, we had the golden age of Greece, the rise of Rome, the Roman Empire, which became the basis for our civilization. But then we had a second dark ages. A second dark ages happened in 476 AD, when another group of barbarians invaded the Western Roman Empire. They were at a lower technological level than the Romans, but they understood that if by destroying the aqueducts, for example, that supplied water to the cities, making the roads unsafe for travel, and making the sea lanes unsafe by piracy, they were, again, knocked the technological props out from under the Roman Empire, and it collapsed. And it took about twice as long for us to come back. Most historians think that Western civilization didn't really crawl back up from the Dark Ages, for about 13 centuries. It took about the early 1800s, late 1700s before we reached, again, a level of sophistication, the population size. In some respects, we didn't come back. For example, literacy was not as widespread in the early 19th century as it was in the Roman Empire. But it took almost twice as long to come back. And why was that? Klein observes that basically the bigger you are, the harder you fall. The more advanced you are technologically, and if you lose that technology, the harder it is to come back and recapture it. So the Hittites and the Babylonians and the Mycenaean Greeks were at a lower technological level than the Romans. And so it only took twice as long to come, it only took half as long to come back. The Romans were more technologically advanced. Well, how technologically advanced are we compared to these classical civilizations? They were in the technological foothills compared to us. And we have scaled the Mount Everest of technology. How long would it take for us to come back if we lost our technology? Could we ever come back from it? Let's go to the first view graph. No, the one after that. Next. There we go. Thanks. Looking in retrospect from our century, when the EMP Commission was thinking about this and the kinds of threats that our civilization faces, the first inkling we have of a threat to our modern electronic civilization that could bring on a third great dark ages and wipe us out as a civilization was an event we're looking back at called in 1859. It was called the Carrington event. The sun can create an electromagnetic pulse. Now, what is an electromagnetic pulse? Basically, it's a super energetic radio wave. It's got so much energy in it, it'll pass harmlessly through your body, but it'll destroy all kinds of electronics. There's so much energy in that radio wave. You might think of it this way. When you go to start your lawnmower, if you've got one of those old lawnmowers where you pull on a cord, it causes a magnetic, it's called a magneto. It's a cluster of magnets, and it starts a magnetic field moving. And that's basically all an EMP is. It's caused by a moving magnetic field. The moving magnetic field will make electrons move in a wire. Just like in your lawnmower, there's a coil in your wire, and the magneto, the moving magnetic field, makes the electrons move, and you can see a little electromagnetic pulse in the spark that goes into the spark plug. Now, the Earth is a giant magnet. It's got a north and a south pole, and it's surrounded by a thing called a magnetosphere, this huge magnetic field. And when the sun shoots out a chunk of itself, we call it a coronal mass ejection, as is shown in this picture. That'll come hurtling at us at about 1 million miles an hour, and sometimes it hits the Earth. And the only thing that saves us from being burned to a crisp is the magnetosphere that God in his wisdom put around our planet. But in the process of saving us, the magnetosphere gets impacted and it moves around. And this happens every year, and we have geomagnetic storms of normal size that usually don't affect us. They affect countries at higher northern latitudes, like Norway or Russia. In 1989, there was the Hydro-Quebec storm in Canada that blacked out half of Canada in 90 seconds. These are run-of-the-mill storms. What we're worried about is a commission was the once in 100, once in 150 year geomagnetic superstorm or solar superstorm, like the 1859 Carrington event. This is not an artist's conception, but it's an actual satellite photograph of what a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection looks like. And if you look at the little blue dot down in the corner, that's the size of the Earth relative to one of these coronal mass ejections. They're immense. And as I said, they travel at least 1 million miles an hour. You don't have to be an astrophysicist to know if that big thing hits our little blue dot, we're going to have a bad day. Now, this almost happened to us on the date that's above that view graph, on July 23rd, 2012. All right? We narrowly escaped getting hit by a coronal mass ejection across the path of the Earth by 3 days and missed us by 3 days. Now, back in 1859, when the Carrington event happened, we weren't an electronic civilization yet, but we're just beginning to be an electronic civilization. This is a telegraph key from 1859, and I think from your seats, even from your seats, you can see what a crude, clunky piece of electronics this is, all right? All over the world in 1859, when the natural EMP from the sun hit, telegraph keys like this melted. The bases caught on fire and they burned down the telegraph stations. Telegraph systems existed all over the world in 1859, everywhere the colonial powers were, and they were in China, they were in India, they were in South America. North America and Europe had just been linked together by a telegraph cable that was strung on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And the pulse was so powerful, it reached down miles deep into the Atlantic Ocean and burned that cable out. It caused telegraph wires all over the world to burst into flame and started forest fires. Now, this didn't end civilization because it was the horse and buggy days, and their civilization didn't depend on electricity. But this big, clunky thing, just think of how much energy is necessary to melt this, okay? Now think of those semiconductors in your cell phone and your personal computers and all the things that make our electronic civilization work today. They're over 1 million times more vulnerable to the natural EMP from the sun from 1859 than this clunky thing. So you don't have to be an electrical engineering PhD to see that an EMP from the sun on the scale of a Carrington event poses an existential threat to our civilization. This would collapse electric grids and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures like communications and transportation, business and finance, even food and water depend directly or indirectly on electricity worldwide and put billions of lives at risk. And that nearly happened on July 23rd, 2012. Now, NASA estimates that the likelihood of the recurrence of an 1859 scale Carrington event, a geomagnetic superstorm, is 12% per decade. 12% per decade. That virtually guarantees that at the latest, within the lifetime of our grandchildren, at the latest, that we're going to experience one of these things. And we haven't done anything to protect the electric grid or the other life-sustaining critical infrastructures from this threat yet. Next view graph. Now, man can also cause an EMP, a civilization-ending type EMP, with a nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude, above the atmosphere. The EMP phenomena that we're talking about here, called high-altitude EMP, begins at an altitude of 30 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And you could go up, the rings show the higher up you go, the bigger and bigger the EMP field gets. So that at 30 kilometers, an altitude a terrorist could reach if he had a nuclear weapon and a weather balloon, for example. A balloon can go up that high. Or you could use a short-range missile, or you could use a private jetliner and do a zoom climb and get up to 30 kilometers. Or if you had a satellite or a longer-range ballistic missile, you could go up to 400 kilometers and do the burst. And that 400 kilometers, you're covering most of Canada, all 48 United States, and a big chunk of Mexico, a single nuclear weapon. But the single nuclear weapon putting a destructive EMP field down over that area, and it would put at risk all the electronics within that field. Another kind of common sense way about knowing that the EMP threat is a real thing, because all of us have kind of experienced minor EMP phenomena in our lives, is this scenario. I'm sure everybody in this room has been driving down a highway listening to the radio on their car. And then you've driven underneath a high power voltage line and suddenly the radio, you lose radio connectivity, okay? Then you come out on the other side and the radio works again. What you've done is you've passed through an electromagnetic field that interferes with the operation of your radio. Now, fortunately, and we try to insulate the high power voltage lines, okay, so it doesn't do permanent damage. And that's why your radio still works when it comes out on the other side. But imagine a field that's 1,000,000 times more powerful than that. And it's not just locally isolated to that part of the highway, but it covers all of North America. That's what you're talking about. And it would fry the electronics in your car, airplane electronics, which, you know, there's about 500,000 people at any given time in the air traveling on over 1,000 airplanes. Those things could crash out of the sky as a result of this. Nuclear reactors, you know, could go Fukushima after their batteries run out, which would only take 7 days. But the worst thing is that, like water, would stop immediately because it takes tremendous amounts of electricity to provide pure water to our cities. And food, there's only enough electrical generating capacity at the big regional food warehouses that resupply your grocery stores, you know, for 72 hours. And after 72 hours, the food starts spoiling. And there's only enough food in those big regional food warehouses to feed a population of 326 million Americans for 30 days. 30 days. That's how much food there is, even if you were able to save the food in the regional food warehouses. You know, people don't think about it, but before we became an electronic civilization, around 1900, you know, we basically didn't really have electric grids, except there was an experimental one beginning in Niagara Falls, New York, invented by a guy named Nikola Tesla, okay? You know, the population of the United States was less than 100 million people, fewer than 100 million people. Now we have 326 million people. That's only because of the technology that we have. And the way to think about a nuclear EMP attack is that it's basically an anti-technology weapon. It subtracts technology from the equation of your civilization. And how many people can survive when you've taken away technology? The EMP Commission calculated that if we had a blackout that lasted 1 year, and if you had a nuclear EMP attack like this, there might be no coming back from it. But if we had an EMP blackout that lasted 1 year, we could lose 90% of our population, 9 of 10 Americans dead from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. It's a high-tech way of killing people the old-fashioned way. Starvation, disease, and societal collapse. Let's go to the next. Okay. And you don't need a nuclear weapon to do an EMP attack. There are non-nuclear radiofrequency weapons. And there are even devices that people can buy in the open market. You don't even need a license to buy them, and this is an example of one. It's from an advertisement from a page in an American electronics magazine. This thing called the EMP suitcase is not a weapon, and the manufacturers didn't intend it to be a weapon. But it's got, you know, the EMP waveform right on the advertisement. This thing, which is just the size of a suitcase, and it looks like a normal suitcase, I've only got 3 minutes left, can generate a field 100,000 volts per meter, you know, over a short range, over maybe 100 yards. Think about that, 100,000 volts per meter. Imagine if you had a plug in your house that put out 100,000 volts. What would you think would happen to anything that you plugged into it, okay? You know, our electronic civilization operates on 120 volts or less. Almost everything operates on 120 volts or less. These nuclear EMP fields that I'm talking about that cover the whole country generate thousands of volts. In the case of a super EMP weapon, you're talking about 200,000 volts per meter. And the bad guys know about this. The North Koreans know about it. I'm almost out of time here. Let me cut to the chase. The EMP Commission provided a plan to Congress. We know the good news is we know how to protect against this. There's really no excuse for our civilization to be vulnerable. It would only cost $2 to $3 billion to harden the electric grid, probably $20 billion to harden all the critical infrastructures. The Department of Defense has been protecting its military systems against EMP for 50 years, so we know how to do it. The President of the United States, President Trump, to his credit, is the first president of the United States in his national security strategy to direct the U.S. government to say you are going to protect the electric grid and the civilian critical infrastructures of EMP. It's right in his national security strategy that he put out in September. The Congress of the United States passed the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, Ron Johnson did this. And it directs the Department of Homeland Security to say, you shall protect the electric grid and the civilian critical infrastructures from EMP. And you will work with utilities to see that this happens. I shouldn't have to be here today, because in the constitutional republic that I grew up, when the commander-in-chief orders the federal bureaucracy to do something, and the Congress of the United States says, yes, as a matter of law, you shall do it, it should be done. Yes? It should be done. But it isn't being done. And I spend so much time arguing with this. There is this real thing called the deep state. There's a bunch of Obama holdovers and a permanent bureaucracy that thinks they know better than the president and the Congress and the EMP Commission. And they don't openly defy the order, but only in Washington do endless studies and endless meetings and conferences, pass for taking action. But the bottom line is, right now, today, not a single recommendation of the EMP Commission to actually physically harden the electric grid or any of the other civilian critical infrastructures has yet been implemented. I'm hoping that will change under this president. There are people that need to be fired. There are large numbers of people that need to be fired. And I think that's the only way it's going to happen. But I thank you so much for hearing me out.